WWF No Mercy for the Nintendo 64 is an all-time classic. Whilst graphics over the years have got better and the experience has got richer and deeper in wrestling games, this humble cartridge has its rightful lofty place in not just the Wrestling Hall of Fame, but in the hearts and minds of all that picked it up, placed it in their console, removed it, blew out the dust, and placed it back in again. How is it, despite the leaps in technology and the incredible heights reached by graps games of today, that the legacy of WWF No Mercy remains untouchable? We're going to dive deeply, without mercy, into No Mercy. We're going to examine the journey developers took to the highest of highs and the bumps, and in some cases, the big bumps along the way. We'll chip away at the iceberg of questions, quandaries, curiosities, and conundrums surrounding the N64's cart crammed with clotheslines. And you and I will marvel at the heritage that this humble 64-bit squared circle dream arena has left behind. That is, unless I'm replaced by Stephen Richards at the last minute. We're going deep, so let's prepare to dig. Dig, diggity, dig, diggity dog. There's been around 200 wrestling video games across the length and breadth of time, starting in 1983 with Data East's Tag Team Wrestling. Don't worry, by the way, we're not going to talk about all 200 odd games. We'll be here forever, or at least the length of time it took for Raw to load on my Packard Bell PC back in today. Tag Team Wrestling is a key starting point, though, as it's here that there are seeds planted that will eventually grow to become WWF No Mercy. In the game, you play as world-renowned tag team Sonny and Terry, unless you're in America, where you play as equally world-renowned Jocko and Spike, as they step to their rivals, a pair of masked wrestlers called the Mad Maulers, or in Japan, simply the heel team. To beat the game, you must out-wrestle the baddies 10 times in a row. That's your career mode. If you lose just one match, back to the bottom of the totem pole you go, kiddo. The game features the barest of bones of a grappling system. You'd tie up with your opponent in the ring, and you'd have a few seconds to perform an action, that being one of 11 moves that included a karate chop, a body slam, a brainbuster, a pile driver, an abdominal stretch. There was even a move called the Rabbit Killer, which was a jumping kick to the back of the head, as opposed to anything more sinister. Each move was worth more points and did more damage. It doesn't sound complicated, but it did embrace the logic and the wildness of pro wrestling in other ways, did Tag Team Wrestling. For example, you couldn't execute a brainbuster on the larger member of heel team. So we had some physics on display here. You could also fight outside the ring, and sometimes a random bloke would just run in from the crowd with what looked like a pipe and batter you senseless before running away. Wrestling! WWF, despite being the capitalist carnivore that we know and love it for, didn't jump on the video game bandwagon until about 4 years after the release of Tag Team Wrestling. It wasn't even a video game that they released, let's be honest. What the users of Amiga, Commodore, and DOS got was kind of a choose-your-own-adventure game where you'd select a move from a menu screen on the left, and then you get a very bit-crunched graphic showing a wrestler doing said move. Your opponent did the same. That carried on until the end of the match, or you got bored and went and watched Married with Children, I guess. The first WWF wrestling game to actually contain, wrestling was released in 1989. About the same time, their competitors released WCW Wrestling. However, WCW was on course to beat them to the punch because recently a prototype was discovered for UWC Wrestling. Now, UWC was the name that for a fraction of the time, Ted Turner's wrestling company went under before it became WCW. It was during this narrow window that the Seta Corporation started developing a game for them, but it never saw the light of day. Meanwhile, the wrestling game offerings in Japan were just storming ahead. It's almost like some of the world's greatest video game developers and producers are from Japan, right? By the early 90s, New Japan, All Japan, War, Joshi Puroresu, and FMW had their own video games on the market. Some were exciting slam simulators that allowed wild dream matches to come true. Some, like the FMW game, saw Onita beating up a knight as a castle exploded around him. Varying levels of quality, but there are strides being made. However, the boldest of strides was taken by Human Entertainment. The same year that WWF and WCW went on their maiden voyages into the real wrestling sims, Fire Pro Wrestling hit the shelves and immediately motored past them in terms of gameplay, style, and longevity. More wrestlers to play as, more moves to do, more matches to have. It became a firm fan favorite very quickly. I'm gonna say it, right? People ask you what your favorite wrestling game is and you want to look a bit hipster, you'll say Fire Pro Wrestling. It's from the company that started the Fire Pro Wrestling world that we meet Shuji Yoshida, who's going to play a key role in the No Mercy story. You see, Yoshida was a former producer and director at Human, but wasn't really part of the Fire Pro story per se. He'd worked on games like F1 Pole Position and Taekwondo, and a Super Nintendo puzzle game called SOS, in which you were on a capsizing ship and you had to use your special skills to get off the boat. Arguably, it could have been the impetus for a WCW career mode when you think about it. Yoshida does get a special credit in the 1994 Sega Saturn semi-wrestling game Blazing Tornado, which was a combo of a wrestling sim and a beat-em-up. But that's about it in terms of Graps game plaudits. Yoshida stepped away from Human to head up his own games company. Whilst he himself hadn't had his hands in the Fire Pro fires, the team he built had several members who had worked on these titles in the past. It was made clear early on that their intention was to develop a brand new wrestling video game franchise that ran up against Fire Pro Wrestling. Together, Yoshida and co. formed the Man Breeze, something Shawn Michaels experienced during his Chaps phase. Weird name aside, it would be under this umbrella that a new vision would be crafted for wrestling in a video game world, was flying headlong into the 3D era. Fire Pro had stayed true to its 2D isometric roots for a long time, but times they were a-changing in the mid-90s. Skateboards, bomber jackets, the Spice Girls, etc. Activision and Ukes were already taking the Graps into the third dimension with New Japan-endorsed Power Move Pro Wrestling on the PlayStation, taking notes from Fire Pro about gameplay as they went. How would the Man Breeze counter this? With what was essentially a prototype for No Mercy in virtual pro wrestling. Developed by the Man Breeze and published by long-term lovers Asmic Ace, virtual pro wrestling would prove to be the foundation of video game wrestling greatness. From the moment you started playing, it was a very different experience from what came before. These big 3D characters with beautifully animated wrestling holds, complemented by swooping camera changes. The use of the light grapple, tapping A, the hard grapple, holding A, light attack, tapping B, and the hard attack by holding B, as well as a casual bit of hot dogging and grandstanding by spinning the stick, was a world away from Fire Pro Wrestling and any other wrestling game that had come before. Button mashers need not apply for virtual pro wrestling. This was very much designed for people who like to give their opponents some technical difficulties, if you catch my drift. It would further the narrative of wrestling romps in other ways too. Wrestling games around this point, like WCW Super Brawl and the criminally underrated Saturday Night Slam Masters, used energy bars like in beat-em-ups. This was more than a jumped-up beat-em-up though, thanks to the introduction of the spirit meter. Swapping out power for spirit allowed players to lose and gain momentum throughout the match, and it would lead to some ludicrously long contests as the spirit level seed and soared. Despite the future fantastic that a 3D wrestling game offered, graphically it wasn't perfect. Many felt the style was a bit too, I guess, lumpy. Wrestling bios describe the wrestlers as looking like the Michelin Man, which is probably the best possible way to sum them up. Lumpiness aside, the game boasted a quite frankly redonkulously sized roster. Fire Pro was already given some decent numbers in that department, but bear in mind up until this point in the West, we would have been lucky to get maybe 8 wrestlers to play as in a video game. But here comes the Man Breeze, with over 50 Japanese and WCW wrestler likenesses in one cartridge. Emphasis on likeness, because this was a Japanese localization and they didn't have the clearance to use some of the actual wrestlers for it. So like Fire Pro Wrestling, they Pro Evolution soccered the lineup to avoid any bother. And this created some charming and delightfully hilarious alternative wrestling personas that Critical Club forum poster Shadowmaster painstakingly translated, for which I give you a hard grapple of gratitude, my friend. So here's a few of my favorites from Virtual Pro Wrestling. Who's Ric Flair? That's clearly Nick Flyer. That's not Black Tiger. That's, Dark Jaguar. Rick Steiner? Nah, pal, that's Mick Schneider. Surely you've met his brother, Stud Schneider. Virtual Pro Wrestling also featured the first in-game appearance of pre-WWF World's Most Dangerous Man, Ken Shamrock. Except it didn't, because this is clearly Kevin Sherlock. And here's the immortal Hulk Hogan. Clearly very concerned about Terry Bollea's legal beagles dropping the big leg. The Man Breeze went as far as to give the leaguester brown hair instead of his classic blonde shower curtain. Just a few months before this game came out, Hogan joined the NWO, and coincidentally, Hulk Hogan had two as well, if you take a look at his secondary outfit choice. The Great Muta became Bloody Musa, which I feel like I should say while shaking my fist at some passing kids on bikes. Bloody Musa, get home, you lot. I know your dad. Brace yourself for the suicidal, homicidal, genocidal, death-defying taboo. All right, one more. He does this, he does that. He's quick like a cat and he'll hit you with a bat. He's the man called Smash. All right, I've got that out of my system now. Where Power Move Pro by Ukes fell down was the lack of awareness in the West. But the Man Breeze found a way to overcome that by getting involved with a hit-making publishing house in THQ and the fastest rising wrestling entity of the 90s, World Championship Wrestling. You may have seen that coming. THQ had been in the publishing and distributing game since the dawn of the 90s, helping to push video game cash-ins on an unsuspecting public. The Home Alone games for the Game Boy, Thomas the Tank Engine on the Mega Drive. You ever play Wayne's World on the NES? That was them too. THQ were distributing all of them to unsuspecting consumers, but they'd never dabbled in the wrestling world before, and that was about to change with the Man Breeze and WCW. With the New World Order invasion leading WCW to all-time company highs, they were wrestling's hot topic by the mid-1990s. So when Virtual Pro Wrestling got a release outside of Japan, they did so by giving it a spray paint job that would draw plenty of eyes. Now known as WCW versus the World, we've got actual WCW wrestlers on the roster. Sorry, Nick Flyer. Apologies to the man called Smash. Best of luck with your future endeavors, pals. However, we now had a reverse licensing problem. And whilst we could have all the WCW guys with their real names, all the Japanese stars now needed to be pro-evolutioned. I said we were done chuckling at the rebrands. Yeah, I lied. Here's some more. That's not the Great Muta. That's now Bad Blood. Gary Albright. Nah, mate. That's, Bear Breath. Who's this Bruiser Brody you speak of? This is Grizz Lee. Stan Hansen doesn't live here anymore. This is clearly the Count. Koji Katao is Kimchi. Wrestling has more than one Kimchi. Interestingly, the Turk here was supposed to be Dynamite Kid, but you notice his finisher is listed as a chokeslam. He has bizarrely the moveset of Vader, but he looks like Dynamite Kid. Yeah, have some fun with that. Yoji Angio. Nope, that's 200 wins. I think that was a last thing on a Friday type decision, that was. All right, we're defo done now, I promise. WCW vs. the World received favourable scores, being called by Electronic Gaming Monthly probably the best 32-bit wrestling game to date, which is both a lovely thing to say, but also a bit hollow, as there's only 2, maybe 3 knocking around by that point. It's like saying this is the best drawing of my cat playing the Nintendo 64 whilst wearing a construction helmet to date. It was a firm foundation for the Man Breeze to build their wrestling empire upon. With that came a new name. The Man Breeze was blown out in favor of Aki Corporation. With a development budget of $1 million, they set about with a follow-up for the Western market, WCW versus NWO World Tour, or in Japan, Virtual Pro Wrestling 64. It improved on the existing gameplay formula, everything flowing a little bit nicer and the camera angles getting far more expressive and exciting, and it genuinely made you feel like you were in the midst of the action on Nitro. The wrestlers also looked a little less lumpy, and it felt more like a WCW game than a Japanese game painted in Dub-C-Dub. It had a roster divided in two, with WCW guys like Lex Luger, Sting, the Steiners, and Flair on one side, and the NWO on the other, with Hogan, NWO Sting, Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, Backlash, and even a playable Eric Bischoff. The Eastern version had a far bigger roster, it must be said, including Bruiser Brody, Terry and Dory Funk, Andre the Giant, The Great Muta, Stan Hansen, Jushin Liger, Masachodo, Hayabusa, Abdullah the Butcher, Vader, Bam Bam Bigelow, Aja Kong, The Great Sasuke, Taka Michinoku, The Road Warriors, Minara Suzuki, Ken Shamrock, and Bloodline adjacent Gary Albright. World Tour had a few of these, but they'd gone to greater lengths to disguise them to avoid Lawsuit Jones over here, except for Abdullah the Butcher. Sorry, Saladin. They had some fun with these fake characters when they wrote the official strategy guide, because they gave them all backstories. For example, Saladin was once, according to the strategy guide, Afghanistan's top secret service operative. Saladin refused his handler's repeated attempts to induce him to assassinate Gorbachev. Now, Saladin uses his skills to defeat, but never permanently disable, his opponents. If it's in the strategy guide, it's gotta be true. The game was awarded Fighting Game of the Year by the Academy of Interactive Arts and sold over 1 million copies in the process. It became THQ's biggest game to date and was praised as incredibly enjoyable, even for non-wrestling fans. How the heck do you top that? As great as this was just THQ and Aki warming up, as proved by the release of WCW vs NWO Revenge in 1998, a game that felt even smoother to play, more game modes to grapple with, and a ludicrously sized roster of WCW stars. Any trace of this being a westernized version of virtual pro wrestling was washed away. It was a World Championship Wrestling presentation. It solidified Aki as the player's choice when it came to wrestling game developers. If you wanted to play the best of the best when it came to wrestling games in the late 90s, you owned a Nintendo 64 and a copy of WCW NWO Revenge. To this day, it stands out as one of the best of its kind. AEW's Brian Cage had his 40th birthday party recently at a hotel room in Las Vegas where he invited the locker room round for a WCW Revenge tournament. That is the staying power that this game has. By the way, Brian, cheers for the invite, mate. Whilst World Championship Wrestling was the number one when it came to wrestling video games in the late 90s, the tide was turning in the real world of pro wrestling. A series of bad decisions by Bischoff's boys and Titan Sports putting stock in a rough and ready new presentation led by a beer-swilling anti-hero saw WWF finally find their attitude and re-establish their dominance in the sports entertainment realm. In the gaming world, though, they were still in their 83 weeks period, you know what I mean? WWF were in bed with Acclaim Entertainment for several wrestling titles that were released at the same time as WCW's Aki games. That included WWF Warzone, which was launched the same year as WCW Revenge, with a very different style, a very different energy, and a very different feel. We had 18 characters squeezed onto a CD, about half of what Revenge was boasting, rendered using a graphics engine first trialed by Acclaim in NHL Breakaway to make the wrestlers look smoother than they did in their competitors' titles, so that was good. It also had a rather robust creator wrestler mode that was there to help fill in gaps in the roster. We still had power bars in Warzone as opposed to the spirit-inspired trackers that Revenge had. Also, instead of one button, one direction moves and holds, you have to press a series of directions and buttons to unleash the most basic of attacks. With a direct comparison like Revenge, fans found it so hard to get behind that kind of gameplay style that you'd find in titles like Mortal Kombat. You'd have to essentially do the Sonic the Hedgehog level select cheat in order to arm drag headbanger mosh. Warzone did, however, boast full commentary from Vince McMahon and Jim Ross, as well as video clips of your favourite WWF stars. It's in this game, by the way, that the now infamous Ahmed Johnson promo is born. I would tell you what he says in it, but to this day, it remains shrouded in mystery. Acclaim followed up Warzone with WWF Attitude. The gameplay was left untouched, but they added more wrestlers, more arenas, more modes. It felt more like a fuller, richer Acclaim wrestling experience. In terms of game modes, it left Revenge in the dust, adding First Blood matches, I Quit matches, a career mode that went beyond here's 10 matches with 10 randos. Once you've done that, we might give you a trophy. The Monday Night Wars had become entwined with the console wars by this point, with playgrounds being filled with arguments over whether WCW Revenge or WWF Warzone was better. WWF fans would mock WCW fans for the crude-looking graphics and lack of commentary. WCW fans would turn their nose up at WWF fans for the tedious button combos needed to perform basic grapples and the repetitive gameplay. I know that for a fact because I was there during those arguments. Most reviews at the time said similar things about the Acclaim titles, that wrestling fans would love them, but it isn't as pick-up and playable for non-fans as Revenge was. Also, despite the depth of game modes, many didn't see it as replayable as Revenge. I mean, you don't see Brian Cage having a WWF Attitude party, do you? Despite the playground arguments, the top lads at WWF knew where the power lay when it came to porting pile drivers for private play. It was whilst Acclaim were beavering away on Attitude that WWF had a clandestine meeting with Aki and THQ to sound out a deal, hoping to encourage them to step away from WCW, which on TV was falling behind the WWF at this point, and welcome them into the loving embrace of the Attitude Era. When WCW head office caught wind that their wrestling game friends were looking at switching sides in the Great Wrestling War, they cancelled any further plans with them, leaving Aki and THQ free to jump to the WWF in early 1999. It would lead to THQ signing a publishing deal with World Wrestling Federation for 10 years, bringing Aki along as its tag team partner. We've spent so much time with them to this point. We should really epilogue Eric Bischoff's Emporium of Elbow Drops and their final rolls of the dice in the video game world, shouldn't we? We had WCW Nitro and WCW Thunder developed by Inland Games. They were painfully okay. The former developed during the height of the Aki era, but not by Aki because they were too busy making the good games. We had WCW Mayhem developed by Electronic Arts that felt like a step so far back it may as well have fallen into the womb. We had WCW Backstage Assault that somehow went further back because they went, let's take the wrestling ring out of the wrestling game and let's just do backstage fights all the time. The true power of Aki is demonstrated in how much WCW fell off when they weren't around anymore. What did this mean for Acclaim, though? Well, they were unceremoniously thrown through the wrestling barbershop window, their friendship butchered with the WWF. They picked up the game engine, now splayed out on the metaphorical barbershop floor, and took it to Paul Heyman, of all people, where Acclaim repainted its WWF games as ECW titles, Hardcore Revolution and Anarchy Rules. They were rubbish. At the time, they were also courted by another video game company who wanted to make an ECW game, but they couldn't commit until their next game had been released and made some big money, so instead ECW went with Acclaim, which I kind of get. But don't worry, whilst I don't know for definite, I'm pretty sure that Rockstar went on to be just fine after that game in question, Grand Theft Auto 3, was released. Anyway, we're here to talk about No Mercy, and this game right here, this is the gateway drug to it. What was going to be WCW NWO Revenge 2 was now Wrestlemania 2000. It played almost exactly like Revenge, but now you had a beefy roster of Attitude Era stars, an impressive creator wrestler, creator championship, and creator pay-per-view mode as well to boot. It had enhanced Revenge in a multitude of ways. It introduced triple threat matches, the steel cage match, the Royal Rumble, which was not unlike Revenge's Battle Royal mode. That's by the by. You had a Road to Wrestlemania story mode. Across the board, the game scored really well in video game magazines as well, many recognizing what WWF had done by jumping into bed with its competitors' gaming team. Those playground arguments were rendered moot when even the WWF team thought the WCW game was better. Hence why they essentially said, here's a bag of money, Aki and THQ, come over here and do that, but in here. Those lads really milked what they had as well, using what they'd made for WrestleMania 2000 to create Virtual Pro Wrestling 2 in Japan, as well as a whole roster of different wrestlers. You had the addition of Round Robin League in Virtual Pro 2, which was basically G1 Climax style gameplay. In terms of the wrestlers themselves, it's a legendary lineup. All Japan wrestlers, New Japan wrestlers, FMW, Michinoku Pro lads, as well as Pride and Pancrase fighters. Billy Gunn will make several video game appearances over the decades, but this is the game that features a rare sighting of Bart Gunn, aka Mike Barton, in the All Japan roster. Also, lovely to see what amounts to a 20th Century Meat Planet division with the likes of Vader, Dr. Death, Steve Williams, Gary Albright, and Kamala in there as well. Sadly, the days of rebadged real wrestlers are over, so we don't get ice cold Stuart Allegro or the Kindly Man in this game. Boo, I say, boo! If If you love WrestleMania, though, you'll love Virtual Pro 2, which is what has made it one of the most imported and modded N64 games in history. Clever people love to pick that game apart and piece it back together. A lot of major wrestling names also cite this version in particular as their favorite of all time. AJ Styles and Kenny Omega have both gushed very publicly about their love for this game, which explains a lot about a particular video game that comes along in a few decades' time. WWF Wrestlemania was a proof of concept, one that finally brings us up to speed. In late 2000, Aki, Asmic Ace, and THQ would give us what would become and remain forever a milestone in wrestling video games. They would give us WWF No Mercy, that launched in North America on November the 14th, 2000, and landed in Europe a month later. WWF had got their media wheels turning in the run-up to the release of this. High-budget commercials that featured the Dudley Boys smashing up a frat house. They were on the cover of video game magazines. Clips of the game would be showed off on Raw and SmackDown as sponsors of the WWF Rewind. We were good to go. First glimpses of the game proved that THQ and Aki were not mucking about. The graphics had been given a big old overhaul. They retained their Aki-ness, for lack of a better term, but improved the character models and adjusted the size of the ring and the arena in general to be more in proportion with what we saw on TV. The animations for the moves and the counters were smooth as butter by this point, and the camera work was even enhanced, really adding to that aforementioned TV experience. Seeing clips of this game in commercials and stills in wrestling magazines sold the Graps fans on this being every bit of a wrestling game magnum opus. The gameplay itself built on the success of the Aki style, with more moves than ever and even the addition of running grapples, something that Aki had been sitting on since WCW Revenge, as Reddit user Melonbread1979 discovered. They found it hidden in the game code, and Aki didn't really want to release it until they'd truly honed it. I guess now they had. This was the first game they included accurate yet frustrating weight detection in matches. The first time something like this has been considered since tag team wrestling in 1983. Remember what I told you about that? It's back with a vengeance here. Good luck in doing any move on Viscera if you're Crash Holly, as the game will turn all of Holly's offense into a hard-fought body slam that you may or may not hit, depending on where your spirit meter, now renamed attitude meter, is at. So as soon as you booted up the game and got into that main menu, you were hit with the dulcet tones of Road Dogg Jesse James. Diggity dog. That's a core memory being unlocked right there, right? The music composer for No Mercy was Kuiji Nikura, who did the music for WCW Revenge and WrestleMania 2000, which is why they all have that very distinctive vibe to them. You can also hear his handiwork in Fire Pro Wrestling Iron Slam 96 on the PlayStation. It shows you what he was capable of if he'd been able to make music on a CD as opposed to squeezing bangers onto a cartridge. He is also credited for non-wrestling titles like Gran Turismo, Clock Tower, and God of War Ragnarok. He's very much a respected name in the biz. However, this bit of music from the WWF game No Mercy wasn't massively loved at first by the developers, according to ex-THQ producer Sanders Keel. You may remember his name from the credits at the end of No Mercy. The music was laughed off initially, but kept in as a placeholder for something else, but they just got so used to hearing it, they just left it in the game. Consequently, this piece of music that they didn't diggity at first became the most memorable part of the No Mercy experience once you booted the game up. Once you've drunk in the music, complete with Mankind saying and The Rock giving a dirty laugh, you took in the most expansive amount of game modes that we'd ever seen in an Aki wrestling game, busting at the seams with triple threat matches, tag matches, Royal Rumbles, tournaments, Iron Man matches, battle royals, first blood matches, steel cage matches, and even, finally, the introduction of the ladder match. Now, fun fact, Acclaim attempted to beat THQ and Aki to the punch on the old ladder match stip. Ultimately, their matches were dropped from WWF Warzone when they couldn't get the ladder component to move in the way they wanted it to. Enter the Aki engine to solve all our problems once again. They took the wrestling outside the arena for the first time in an Aki game, with backstage brawls giving us this expansive maze of corridors, boiler rooms, locker rooms, loading areas, even a bar, cracking a fire extinguisher over Bradshaw's head in the friendly tap, whilst your mate powerbomb Farouk through the pool table. Ah, mate, this is what it's all about. The game also gave us a multitude of careers to embark upon with the championship mode. This wasn't just a string of matches anymore like previous story modes had been. It included actual storylines with all your favorites giving us their catchphrases and speech bubbles. For the first time, this felt like an immersive sports entertainment experience. They added more replayability to an already instantly replayable video game with the inclusion of the SmackDown Mall. Doing championship modes earned you WWF dollars, and that allowed you to purchase new wrestlers, new attires, new moves, new taunts, all sorts. The pricing of the items in the SmackDown Mall was very baffling. I want to touch on this. What a strange economy the WWF No Mercy universe has going on. If I wanted to buy Al Snow's styrofoam head as a weapon to pull out of the crowd, it's going to cost me 1,000 WWF dollars. However, what's that? You want an oversized copy of The Rock's crap autobiography, The Rock Says? Certainly, that'll be 30,000 WWF dollars, please. Oh, you'd like the WWF Armageddon 1999 arena, complete with netting and tanks from the top of the ramp? 20,000 WWF dollary dues, please. You want The Rock's $800 shirt? Sorry, pal. Supply and demand. 80,000 WWF dollars, please. You could buy wrestlers in here as well, like we said. Like Shawn Michaels, Ken Shamrock, and Cactus Jack could be unlocked for about 50k each. The most expensive human purchase in the SmackDown Mall? It was The Godfather's lady as a playable character for $500,000. How did Godfather go out of business if playing with his ladies would set customers back 500,000 WWF dollary dues? The game was massive, so the SmackDown Mall served not only as a way to further give you reasons to keep playing, but also a way to sneak even more wrestlers into the game. You could buy the clothing parts to make more existing WWF stars to beef up the character selection screen even more. And let's finally talk about said beef in the character selection. And I think this is a key reason why WWF No Mercy is as iconic as it is. The timing of this game's release was exceptional. 2000 was a landmark year for the WWF, the company being floated on the stock exchange and visibility of wrestling being at an all-time high thanks to guys like The Rock, who was on the cusp of being a Hollywood megastar. We were 2 years out from the birth of Attitude, and 2000 would go on to be the final full year of that paradigm-shifting era. So as a result, No Mercy was blessed with arguably the greatest roster of the Attitude era. The first page of the selection screen had the likes of The Rock, Triple H, Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Undertaker, Chris Jericho, and fast-rising newcomer Kurt Angle. You had the future of the WWF on the second page, the Hardys, Edge and Christian, Rikishi, Too Cool, and the Dudleys. You had DX, the Radicals, the APA, the Right to Censor, all coming into their own on WWF TV at this point. You had all the mid-card guys as well, like Al Snow, Steve Blackman, the Hollies, Kai and Tai. Grand total of 7 wrestlers in the women's division to play as. But at the time, I think that was about the size of the women's division in the WWF anyway. From here, Aki had some fun. Hidden unlockable characters included legends like we've discussed, Shawn Michaels and Cactus Jack and Ken Shamrock. You had Andre the Giant hidden in there as well. And then you had daft unlockables like Pat Patterson and Gerald Briscoe, Mark Henry's octogenarian lover, Mae Young, along with the fabulous Moolah. JR, Jerry Lawler, and Michael Bloody Cole were in there too, alongside Earl Hebner and Jeebus. Linda McMahon was a playable character. When devising this roster, they left hardly any stones unturned. How the heck did they cram all of this, plus 80-odd playable stars, into a small but perfectly formed N64 cartridge? Well, they had to make cuts somewhere, and this is apparently why No Mercy only had half entrances as opposed to the full ring walkouts like Revenge and Wrestlemania 2000. By taking out 50% of the entrance, you could fill the game with more good stuff, and boy, was it good stuff they filled it with. No Mercy was great, but it wasn't perfect. Games have glitches. It comes with the territory. Even the most beloved and lovingly crafted games will fall foul of something wacky within the code. No Mercy's no exception. There's a semi-famous No Mercy bug, around a bizarre semi-naked man of mystery that appears during the Hardcore Championship career mode. Doesn't have any moves other than a basic chop and goes by the name Data 2500. Seems like he's a placeholder, but not enough is known about him. He should surely be considered for the Hall of Fame. Also, if you stand on the commentary table and do, I think it's taunt 196 and kick at the same time, your character floats and you can run into the crowd. Keep running and you'll see the ring get smaller and smaller, leaving you to contemplate the true futility of existence in a universe so big. However, one glitch proved to be more than just a quirky bit of fun. One glitch turned into an all-out PR nightmare for WWF No Mercy. You see, the first batch of cartridges, some of which were in a gorgeous charcoal black cartridge case, contained a game-breaking glitch. Utilizing a flash-saving method on the cart, customers complained that at random points, they'd turn their cartridges on and find all the saved data, their created wrestlers, their near 90% completion of Road to Wrestlemania, all gone. Imagine spending hours making that perfect version of the Ultimate Warrior in the Creation Suite, only to forget to put it on your memory pack and find the hours that you spent in your room were all for naught, with Hellwig flushed from existence. May have happened. A few cartridges turned into a dozen, and then hundreds. And this led to THQ opening a support page on their website for people losing their minds over the spontaneous amnesia of their game cartridge. THQ and Aki put the onus on Nintendo for that, saying it was an issue with the battery in the cartridge. The whole issue caused tremendous anxiety in THQ and Aki, as you would imagine. Their advice to gamers was to reset the cartridge and all the saved data. I think you have to press start as the game is loading. But of course, that didn't work. It led to THQ encouraging people with glitched copies to send them directly to their head office and get them replaced with shiny, non-corrupted new ones. Alternatively, you could hop on eBay where there were some grifters selling glitch-free copies of No Mercy for hundreds of dollars. One ex-THQ employee did just that in 2014. They allegedly found a bunch of free copies that were given to THQ staff in California. He didn't mark them up as ridiculously expensive, thankfully. It does speak volumes for the greatness of this game, though, as people love the bones off it enough to continue to persevere with a game that would sporadically snap your created characters out of existence. The bizarre tale of the No Mercy game break didn't stop there, though. The European market got fixed copies of the cartridge that bizarrely contained no in-game blood. The characters would still feign getting bloodied, where they would get struck, touch their forehead, and then collapse in a heap, clearly fainting at the sight of their own fluid, but no blood would be on show. The theory behind the cancellation of copious character claret is the German market was a bit more strict when it came to blood in their video games, and this is why games like Carmageddon 64 had victims spewing green goo as opposed to the tried and trusted red blood in other parts of the world. They also swapped out human enemies for dinosaurs too, so it was dinosaurs bleeding green all over the road, which was apparently far more palatable, but I digress. Some say that the glitch gave THQ a chance to drain the blood from the game in order to appease censors on the continent. Hilariously, First Blood mode and the Road to Wrestlemania challenges that required you to make your opponent bleed remained in the game. It was fine though. I mean, who doesn't love challenging your brother to a first nothing match? Beyond the Nintendo 64, THQ had designs on increasing the reach of No Mercy with a Game Boy Color version. They'd done that with Wrestlemania 2000, offering a handheld remix with stripped back gameplay and a tiny roster. But it wasn't greatly received. THQ felt that lessons were learned from that one, and the plan was to push more into those tiny square Game Boy cartridges than ever with a portable No Mercy. It was developed initially by Aki and Asmik before being handed over to Natsume, who made the previous THQ WWF game. The main element of it would be the first ever handheld creator wrestler mode. You design a character and take them through a bespoke story mode. Once completed, you'd plug your cartridge into the N64 Game Boy pack, you'd turn on No Mercy for the N64, and you'd continue the story there. The plan was also for you to unlock exclusive items in the Game Boy Color version that you could play with the console edition. You would have also been able to grind for WWF dollars in the Game Boy iteration and transfer the funds to your N64 wallet. You'd be affording that cheese head in no time. However, this was not to be. The game was supposed to be ready by Christmas 2000, and when deadlines passed with No Mercy, the whole thing was permanently shelved. No footage of this game has come to light. There were claims a while ago that leaked in-game graphics turned up on the internet and were scrubbed by Natsumi themselves. However, there is evidence of the plans in general. Hidden in the game code of No Mercy on the N64 is a Game Boy Color story mode, found buried in the memory. There's several videos on YouTube of people playing through this secret extra No Mercy storyline, in which Triple H and Stephanie McMahon Helmsley try to take you out whilst The Rock cheers on your created wrestler. It's not the toughest nut to crack, but it's a cool curiosity for people willing to explore the No Mercy iceberg a little further. In fact, let's talk about that story mode for a minute. And another legendary part of that No Mercy iceberg, the WWF Championship storyline. Due to the time this game was in development, the storyline leading into your world title bagging moment was lifted wholesale from the WWF TV product in early 2000. You were placed into the Wrestlemania 2000 story arc, with your chosen character taking the spot occupied by The Rock in his battle against the evil of the McMahon-Helmsley era. This meant that hilariously, your character would sometimes start speaking in the third person. The key curiosity from this comes from one of the antagonists in that story. In the real world, The Rock was feuding with Triple H and The Big Show. However, in the game, you were feuding with Triple H and perennial mid-card comedy act Steven Richards, the leader of the Mary Whitehouse-loving Right to Censor. Non-wrestling fans didn't care, they had a lovely time. Us nerds, however, were baffled by this decision. I mean, this is the period that saw The Big Show as a main player in the WWF. So why wasn't he in this story mode? Come to think of it, why wasn't Big Show in this game at all? Is it an oversight? It wasn't, because The Big Show is in this game. His face map is hidden in the code, and all his attire is either in the Create a Wrestler suite or purchasable in the SmackDown Mall. Well, Paul White had fallen out with WWF management in April of 2000, the company wanting him to get in better shape. White was belligerent to this and was punished by being written off television and sent down to developmental territory Ohio Valley Wrestling, where he was ordered to get some pounds off. Numerous attempts to get Big Show to get his physique and attitude under control had failed, so the company wanted to hit him where it hurt, in his wallet. Thus, by removing Big Show from WWF No Mercy, the company's biggest wrestling game offering to date, he wouldn't get a single royalty check from it. So all of the people to drop into that storyline instead of Big Show, why Steven Richards? This is something that's even stumped Steven Richards himself, who said he laughs about it to this day every time he sees The Big Show. There are several theories on this. Some believe it was because Richards had previously had a gimmick where he imitated other wrestlers, so that may have been why. Some believe that it was just he was indexed in the game in such a way that slotting him in to replace Big Show wasn't going to cause too many issues with coding, so there may have been no logic to it after all, just whatever needed to get done to get it sorted. Regardless, Steven Richards replacing Big Show is a well-established No Mercy meme that lives on in all of our hearts. The greatest push Steven Richards ever received in his WWE career came from the No Mercy story mode on the Nintendo 64. To play it, No Mercy felt like the culmination of years of development, from Virtual Pro Wrestling 1 to now. Every step along the way was leading up to this. The engine had been tweaked and neatened, and whilst retaining its pick-up and play ability, it gave seasoned Aki followers more flavor than ever. It's like watching a TV show that is globally beloved that every now and then sprinkles in an Easter egg for its core audience as a thank you. Many will agree that No Mercy was a gaming experience best shared, with the Nintendo 64 supporting 4 controllers at once without the need of a weird PlayStation boomerang contraption, and the ability to have 4 wrestlers interacting on the screen at once. It meant this became a proper party game. So much of the legacy of this game comes from those days where your mates and your family would come round and go to war with custom wrestlers with normally hilarious results, as we had done in Revenge, and as Brian Cage had done at his birthday party. Thanks for the invite. I've got 2 brothers who loved No Mercy as much as me, and we played it to death. A lot of my favourite memories from No Mercy didn't come from championing The Rock to become the champion, but from the bizarre characters that Jim and Mike would make. Big shout out to Beast, who was a 7-foot powerhouse with Viscera's face, and David Lockett, who, not entirely sure what David Lockett was, come to think of it. I've never shown these before, right? But When an opportunity presents itself, I'll get actual wrestlers to put David Lockett over, just so I can pop my brother Mike on his way home from work.
Hey, Gangrel, great work tonight, great work, great match tonight, hard-fought victory for you this evening as well.
It would have been a lot harder if David Lockett was just fanging and banging. You know what? He always makes me want to give somebody a bloodbath. I've never been tested like that before.
You and David Lockett, you go back years, don't you?
Oh, it's all this, bad enough take some David Lockett. I'll come for you.
Spending the afternoon with Jeff Jarrett. Now, Jeff, of all the opponents you've had, who's the toughest that you've ever been in there with?
That takes in 37 years.
37 years of people, Jeff. What we got?
David Lockett.
David Lockett.
It's unbelievable.
He's tough.
Do you know how good he is?
I've seen clips. He's tough, man.
I'm great. He's greater than great.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, well, he's not here today, thankfully, but
Oh, no.
I'll pass this along to him, most definitely.
You know what happened to him, don't you?
I heard there was an accident involving Mean Cliff. Or something.
listen.
We don't talk about it.
Mean Gene, Lord Alfred Hayes. Let's leave it.
That one.
Let's leave it.
We'll leave it.
Those ridiculous videos would never have happened without WWF No Mercy. I'm sure you would have had your own David Locketts that captured titles and hearts and minds during your years wrestling via Nintendo's weird M-shaped controller. There's no doubting that the ease in which anybody and everybody could hop in and land some sweet-looking moves with relative ease is why No Mercy is so fondly remembered. It was critically acclaimed too. Game aggregator Metacritic scores it a phenomenal 89 out of 100. It was nominated for Game of the Year at the Interactive Entertainment Awards as well. Despite this, it is only the third best-selling wrestling game in N64 history. Over 1 million copies sold, but they lost out to WCW Revenge and WCW World Tour, the former closing in on 2 million. The great cartridge glitch issue would have no doubt played a part in that number being lower than its WCW predecessors, but it has created a timeless legacy regardless of that. So where do you take it from here? How do you improve further on WWF No Mercy? Well, the rumor mill began turning in 2001 that a sequel to No Mercy was in the works called WWF Backlash. Aki and THQ had a 12-month deadline, allegedly, to put this game together with an up-to-date roster and, according to set speculations, the inclusion of 6 playable characters on screen at once and a brand new match type, the Hell in a Cell. So according to stories online, Aki got underway developing WWF Backlash. Talk of this sequel did the rounds for years before an interview with producer Sanders Keel put them down for the count. Sanders said there were no plans for WWF Backlash and it was a rumor of no fixed origin. Despite this, Aki smashed their second WWF outing and it seemed like just a matter of time until they began working on something new. This was happening or not happening, as THQ formed an adjacent tag team partner with developers THQs, the guys behind Power Move Pro Wrestling in the 90s, to make WWF games for the PlayStation. They'd been leveling up since Power Move, making Japan-exclusive New Japan games that, in retrospect, look like No Mercy and SmackDown had a rather strange baby. THQ had a management change at the top who were high on the work that THQs were doing on the next-gen console wrestling games. Their relationship with Aki, however, wasn't great after No Mercy, despite their success of the game and the whole Glitchermania thing not strictly being their fault. A lot of things Aki did that the old THQ team let slide, like missing deadlines and spending too much money, the new lot weren't willing to put up with. Reports say that as Aki got underway on their next wrestling game, the new THQ bosses informed them that Nintendo were throwing all efforts into developing for the upcoming GameCube console, and all assets would need to be rebuilt for that instead. Aki approached THQ about maybe working on the PlayStation 2 instead as opposed to the new Nintendo hardware, and this would end up being the last straw. The new THQ management dropped Aki, and THQs was their new best friend. Whilst a few members of the Aki team would end up moving to THQs to develop games like Wrestlemania X8, WWF Raw, and the iconic SmackDown Here Comes the Pain, it was very much the end of an era. Aki wasn't done with wrestling games though. Remember those turgid WCW titles that EA made? Well, Aki almost found themselves back on the Turner dime with plans to bring their award-winning Graps engine back to World Championship Wrestling for WCW Mayhem 2. However, we were denied the most unexpected comeback since Samantha in And Just Like That, due to the small matter of WCW being bought by the WWF. EA weren't perturbed by the wasteland that pro wrestling was becoming post-invasion. They still wanted a Graps game. So instead of wrestlers, we got rappers with Def Jam Vendetta. Whilst many wrestling fans weren't clamoring to pit Method Man against DMX, they were clamoring to get their teeth into that sweet next-gen Aki game engine once more. It actually sold as well as No Mercy. So maybe Aki were onto something when they asked THQ to move to the PlayStation. In the decades that have passed since No Mercy, the games have become graphically superior and the gameplay has been tweaked and rejigged all over the years. Whether it was THQ and Ukes or Visual Concepts and THQ in the main event picture, the love for No Mercy has never gone away. To this day, that appetite for Aki style of sports entertaining is satiated by a dedicated, passionate fan community who claw through the game code like a ferret in a vending machine. No Mercy mods breathe new life into No Mercy by sweetening the graphics, creating new arenas, adding a plethora of new wrestlers, and creating new wrestling moves using what I can only assume is some form of witchcraft. If you wanted further evidence of the untouchable legacy of WWF No Mercy, take time to scour the modding community message boards, clusters of creative fans that painstakingly take this 24-year-old game and redesign it, remix it, reimagine it, and bring it to life for a whole new generation. You can also turn to AEW for evidence of No Mercy's everlasting love, as Kenny Omega brokered a deal to bring No Mercy director Hideyuki Iwashita on board for their first foray into fake fighting, Fight Forever. The director of Aki Wrestling Games and the Ukes team working on an AEW game? Surely this will be the best wrestling game of all time. Womp womp. But here we are, over 2 decades since its release, and there is so many people still talking about the greatness of WWF No Mercy. And this isn't throwing shade on other wrestling games out there. Fire Pro Wrestling has forever been a critic's choice. WWE, under the watchful eye of 2K, have really made some big strides in the last few years. And personally, they're games that I love to play as often as I possibly can. But there is a special magic about WWF No Mercy that just never faded, and it's in that warm feeling that you get when you play a game that you know passion and pride and energy have been poured into, and a game that somehow, despite how the world has turned, despite how we have improved as gamers and game developers, there is something warm and friendly and addictive about that game. It is for that reason that over 2 decades later, I'm sat here and have been sat here for as long as I've been sat here, gushing about what is, without question, the untouchable legacy of WWF No Mercy. Dig, dig, diggity, dig, diggity dog.